Hello, my name is ioStux. I'm the current coaching director for Hell Esports and the former head coach for XL2 Academy, Toronto Esports, and Uprising Academy. I'm going to do a quick analysis of the San Francisco Shock versus Titans Overwatch League Season 2 Grand Finals. This is going to go more in depth than most reviews, but less in depth than it could be, just for the sake of kind of constraining a little bit of time. The main priority is going to be to explain the decision making of both teams and to go into how those decisions impacted the outcome of the game and how those decisions could have been adjusted to change the outcome of the game.
Five, four, three, two, one.
So the first interesting thing that happened in this game was that Titans decided to roll out with a Brig instead of a Moira. The reason Moira is being picked in this comp is because it synergizes much better with the over-aggressive frontline of Doom Reaper. The reason that they picked Brig is twofold. For one, they wanted to make sure that they catch Shock off guard, because Shock would not expect the Brigette to pick. The overall playstyle that they're looking for is they're sacrificing sustain in order to punish the Reaper and the Doomfist. As soon as the Doom or the Reaper go in, the Brig can stunlock them, which means that they can't rely on their uppercut E, their punch, or their Wraith form to get out. So the entire play for the Titans here is to bait Shock into playing over-aggressive, looking for a Brigitte stun, and then punishing that stun as it happened, preventing Shock from using any abilities to get out. One of the interesting things to note here is that Titans actually ended up rolling out a little bit late. They just messed up their initial rollout, and the Reaper player is late. He's not in the Lucio aura either. In this case, usually that would be fairly bad, getting this early rollout, because it means that one of the teams has to... one of the teams gets control of White for free, which sucks for the other team because they're going to be stuck in the choke, which makes it much easier for the Doomfist and the Reaper to get value. In this case, it is not the biggest disadvantage because, as we just saw, the main game plan of Titans with the Brig is to try and punish Sinatra and Striker for going in. So playing this far back is actually fine because it gives Shock a sense of overconfidence almost, which they can use to, which they can punish properly. So Sinatra decides to go for the early engage, which makes sense. In general, with this composition, you just want to play as proactive as possible. And Titans, in general, is in kind of a bad position. And what ends up happening here is it's a little bit quick, so I'll try to slow it down. Is the Brig actually ends up hitting the stun on Sinatra, but their communication wasn't where it's supposed to be. Or rather their synergy overall. One of the main things you can notice with Titans in this match is that a lot of the stuff that they've been doing here, they came up with on short notice and they didn't practice it properly. The Brigitte pick, for example, is something that they most likely have not practiced as much, which is why I also disagree with the pick. Shock is very confident on that composition. It's the composition that they used to get a golden run through playoffs. As soon as Twilight goes for the stun, this should have ideally been a free pick on Sinatra, which they then could have used to gain momentum and win the rest of the team fight. That's not what ends up happening. For one, because Haxal decides to go for a flank. If you decide to go for a playstyle where you want to use the Brig to punish people going in, Haxal should not be going for flanks. And also in this situation, Slime decides to go for a boop, and needless to say, that sucks because it makes it very difficult for the rest of the team to follow up on Sinatra in this situation. Now, Haxal with his flank does end up getting a little bit of value out of everything. But one of the things that even happens for Shock is on Violence and here, where he's starting to walk backwards. And he actually gets stuck on that wall, which causes him to eventually die. And obviously this gives the Titans an advantage, but the main problem is that they missed out on their opportunity to punish Sinatra. The reason that's really bad is because the Brigitte doesn't give them a whole lot of sustain. Shock has a significant sustain advantage, even though they just lost their Moira, which kind of evens things out. But all that's remaining now is just the fact that Titans has a lot less space. So again, Titans is all clumped up in this corner, whereas Strikers coming in from this angle, the rest of the Shock also have control of this wide area. So while the whole Brigitte pick doesn't make the biggest difference now, the fact that they're late to point just makes a very big difference. They don't have the space to really contest anything here. gonna up the speed here, because the rest of the fight is essentially just clean up. Not much happens here. They're just cleaning Titans up. They don't really have the sustain to do anything, and at that point Shock had enough space to not take any damage. Okay, let's quickly talk about the defensive hold. So Titans decides to keep the Brig around, first of all, because Brig is close to rally. So swapping at this point would suck, because double shield in general is very, very ult-reliant. If you swap away 60% to a rally, you're gonna be having a bit of a problem. So they decided that, hey, the play worked. We ended up catching off Sinatra. The problem is they don't have the element of surprise anymore. So Shock can just play around the Brigitte. And second, the issue is that the Brigitte still doesn't really give them a whole lot of sustain. So in terms of the matchup overall, they have the disadvantage until Twilight actually gets a rally. With a rally, they can kind of use it as a replacement for Coalescence, but really the main reason they just stuck to this at this point is they probably realized it didn't work and they wanted to swap, but if they would swap here, they would just be even further behind in ultimates and it wouldn't work. Now, the idea here is that, or rather the thing that's interesting is the way that Shock is holding. So instead of deciding to go for a hold on the point, they decide to hold white. Now this is specific to the Doomfist comp, because it forces Titans into a lot of very bad decisions. For one, Titans could go up these stairs. Going up those stairs sucks, because it's way too narrow, which means that they're going to get spammed out by the Sigma, they're going to get spammed out by the Doom and by the Reaper. They could go through Dark, which doesn't make any sense either, because they're just going to get held at this door. Which means that their best option, realistically speaking, is to just go through main. Now, if you're playing this comp and you hold main from over here, it is a little bit more difficult for the Doomfist to get value, because any punches he lands is only going to knock the enemy team further back, which means that his team can't follow up on it, and it's very difficult for him to get a one-shot. But if they're holding like this, for one, they have much more cover, because the area in and of itself is more enclosed, and it also makes it much easier for Sinatra to land punches, because instead of having to punch down the hallway, what he can do instead is, as Titan starts pushing up, he can punch them either against this pillar or against this wall, both of which can lead to a pick. Now, with the pull, they don't really need to wait for an opener. Referring to the pull Doomfist combo that they're going to use in a second here, so I'm just going to let this play out. So this is another thing that's worth noticing, actually. One of the things about their defensive setup is that while the entire team was playing over here in white, Smurf was actually playing main. And the idea behind this is that the team can come from this side, but instead of having to squeeze himself through those stairs with the rest of his team, this allows him to scout. One of the main issues is that if you're holding up there, you won't really see when the enemy team comes down main, so you can't properly punish them. If they have the Orisa main, that problem doesn't really exist, because he can just look down main, he can tell his teammates when they're coming, and then Sinatra can kind of ready himself for the engage. If they were all holding up there, then by the time they would recognize that Titans is there, the reaction time would just have to be too quick. So it's easier to just get that heads up, hey, they're going to go around the corner, so Sinatra can start charging up his punch. So Smurf moves in from the front, he drops his shield. At this point, again, this comp is fairly ult heavy, so Sinatra knows that he's going to get his ultimate just from that initial engage, because he only needs to land a few abilities. And they decide to go for an impromptu pull Doomfist ultimate. The play in of itself is fairly standard. At this point, Sinatra didn't really have a lot of choice, because he ended up getting punched back. So he decided to use his ultimate for one to get back into the fight, and he just quickly called it. And this is one of the main differences between the Titans and the Shock. This play by Shock is something that they have practiced a lot. Not because it was executed cleanly. The reason why they have practiced, or how we know that they have practiced it a lot, is because of how quick it was. So Sinatra didn't really properly plan for this ultimate, because he didn't have it in advance. The initial plan was still to just go in for the punch, because you don't want to rely on using ultimates to win a fight, especially with a comp like this, because ideally you just end up getting a pick at Doomfist and then you can save ultimates and you don't really have to worry. But he got his ultimate mid-fight, and he saw an opener to do it, and he just called that, and Smurf immediately knew what to do. And he decided to go in for the pull, which means that Sinatra can follow up on it. And that sort of coordination is something that Titans wasn't able to showcase throughout this entire map. Now that fight for the Titans in general sucked anyways. The main goal for Titans in this situation is not to win the teamfight, because the only way that they can actually win a teamfight here is if they get a pick with their own Doomfist. That a small opener, where Sinatra didn't have his ultimate yet, maybe if they could have stunned him with Brick, they would have been able to kill him and then win the fight off of that. But we don't really expect them to win this fight here, because they're at a massive ult disadvantage and a positional disadvantage. So their best bet is to just try to get these fights over with as slowly as possible, because the slower these fights are, it does cost them capture percentage. It is, it does cost them time, but at least they're farming ult charge. Whereas what the Shock want to do is they want to make sure that these team fights go over as quickly as possible, because the faster these team fights end, the less ult charge Titans is going to get. Okay. So at this point, Shock is very close to the Sigma ultimate, which means that there's no need for them to play around corners. Rather, they just want to play together so that they can follow up on the Sigma ultimate. They're still going to do a normal engage with Sinatra to see if they can just win off of that. There really is no reason not to do that, because if they're going to follow up with the Sigma ultimate, Sinatra doesn't have to, worry about dying, because he's going to have follow-up. So they're going to go with the Sinatra engage, and then they're going to use the Sigma ultimate to actually win. This area here is still extremely strong for them, because it's very easy to follow up on the Sigma ultimate. If they would do what they did earlier, where the team was holding here, and the rest of the team, and Smurf was holding here, then the Doomfist could land easier punches, but that is not really the win condition of this fight. What they're trying to play around is just the Sigma ultimate, so they're setting themselves up for it, because if the Sigma ults enemies around here, and the rest of the team is playing here, it's very, very difficult to actually follow up on the Sigma ultimate. Now, the reason why they aren't holding close, so theoretically speaking, this choke over here is easier to hold on because it's narrower, which increases pressure on the enemy team. The reason they're not holding there is because, as mentioned before, they just want to make sure that they waste as much of Titan's time without Titans getting any sort of ultimate charge out of it. So by playing this far back, they can make sure that Titans wastes more time walking towards the point, only to run into a Sigma ultimate and then get one shot. Whereas if they're holding close, then the fight in of itself would end sooner, but it would also start sooner. So the length of the fight is essentially the same, but this way they just waste more time actually walking to the point. Okay, now Violent also decides to use his ultimate proactively. The reason he's using his ultimate is not because this is an amazing opener, but because their ult economy is so strong anyways, that at this point he's just using it for two reasons. For one, it's safe, because the only way that Titans can win a teamfight here is by getting a pick, and using Coalescence prevents them from getting a pick. It makes it less likely that Smurf, for example, is just going to get one shot. And also because, as mentioned before, it makes sure that the fight ends earlier. So they still plan on using the Sigma ultimate, but because they have a very strong ult eco, they're very close to beat, they're very close to Reaper ultimate, they can afford to drop this ultimate, not because they need it to win the teamfight, but because they need it to win the teamfight fast. And if they win the teamfight fast, they can continue snowballing. And again, with these fights, you can see that they just try to play extremely fast. Striker, for example, played extremely aggressive, and he ended up getting picked for it. But that is completely irrelevant, because the main priority here isn't whether they lose people. All they care about is, did we win the fight? And how fast did we win the fight? If they lose people in the process, that is not super important for them. They just need to make sure that they keep that in mind when they set up for the next team fight. In this case, another advantage of engaging fast is that one of the things about Lucio in this current meta is that whether you win or lose a teamfight has a small effect on how quickly you actually charge beat. So even though Moth ended up getting his beat faster than Slime because they just won this teamfight, as we can see right here, Moth has the exact same amount of ult percentage as Slime, even though Shock has been absolutely destroying Titans so far. So it is very easy to accurately predict how close the enemy Lucio is to his beat, because it is just not dependent, not very dependent on the outcome of each team fight or how effective the Lucio individually is, because there just isn't a whole lot that the Lucio can do besides, shooting shields. He knew that since he was close to beat, Slam was close to beat, which is again just another reason that they want to play very, very proactive. The more proactive they play, the less ult charge Titans is going to get. And in this case, it's to their advantage because they want to use Sigma ultimate before Slime gets his ultimate. So again, they could have stalled this for longer and get more capture percentage while still winning the fight. But the longer they wait, the more ult charge Titans is going to get. And if they get beat, then there's a chance that Shohei isn't going to get a free Sigma ultimate. But because of their proactiveness, they just get the free Sigma ultimate off. Again, at this point, this is just Snowball. Now, this is where the fights get a little bit more interesting, because both teams have a decent chunk of ultimates. Okay. In terms of setup, it is... Actually, let me run this for a little bit more. There we go. So, in terms of setup, this is pretty much the same thing as earlier, where they're trying to... They don't have the Sigma ultimate anymore, which means that they want to go back to the setup that they used previously for the Doomfist. Again, they're all loading here. Smurf is going to hold on the point, and then they just try to go for the punch and then push here. Now, what Titans is doing is going to check the catch the shock off guard a little bit. Before we go into that, though, to quickly comment on Doomfist, main two ways for Doomfist to open up a fight is you either going with Slam and then uppercut and punch your way out, or you're going with punch. In terms of a consistency, going in with a Slam and an uppercut gets you more value than the punch consistently, like on average, if you would just do it over and over again. Whereas the punch is kind of an all or nothing situation. So getting a pick with your punch obviously has much higher value than landing a big Slam. But landing a big Slam against another double shield is very consistent, whereas landing a punch could go wrong. Sometimes you're just going to hit a golden Orisa and it's not going to do anything. In this case, because Shock is playing on this map, it's very, very close. There's a lot of walls. It's much easier for Sinatra to just open up with his punch and not with his Slam, because there's a higher likelihood of him actually getting any kills with his punch. Now, the problem is there is a miscommunication. So the reason why Smurf wants to play on the point is so that he can scout here and then see when the team is, when Titans is coming from main. So that Shock goes in from here, Smurf goes in from here, and then they can just win the fight around this area. What ends up happening here, however, is that Titans goes up through these stairs. And Shock's frontline, especially Sinatra, he should have been able to see that coming. And he does eventually tell Smurf that they are coming through there. Because Smurf being in this position, if the enemy team doesn't come from main, sucks. Because at that point, the amount of pressure that Shock is applying onto Titans while they're going through this narrow corridor is much, much, much more smaller, because they just don't have the same shield. So Smurf ends up rotating back to his team fairly late. So Titans can just go for free. And if we rewind this a little bit, we can see that Sinatra would have actually survived this if there was an Orisa shield that he could have played around. In this case, he only had the Sigma shield, which is inconsistent. So right now he is just completely exposed, and Smurf isn't quite there yet. Now, the positioning after the Sinatra pick is still really bad for the Titans. So this fight isn't necessarily as one-sided as it would be, taking into account the pick. But the main difference is that Titans actually has ultimates that they can use to do stuff now. So in this case, even though the positioning from the Titans isn't as great because they had to force themselves through that narrow short, because Smurf rotated slowly because of the lack of communication, because Sinatra ended up getting picked, and because Titans has ultimates now, that's what ends up leading to a flip. And it's very difficult for Shock to actually confirm any kills without Sinatra, because he has been one of the most impactful characters throughout this entire series for the Shock. The Reaper in of itself can, of course, have very high impact, but one of the most noteworthy things about Shock's play in this series as a whole is Sinatra's confidence as a player, because he went into this match knowing that he was going to win. So what Shock decides to do is, because they're confident, which is definitely the right choice, they commit Beat, they commit Orisa Supercharger, and they commit Reaper Ultimate in order to try and make up for the Doomfist pick. So at this point they're at a numbers advantage, and the longer they remain at a numbers advantage, the larger the advantage that Titans gets. But if they lose their Doomfist, and then the enemy Doomfist dies like 2 seconds after, then Titans doesn't really have a huge advantage. So they're committing ultimates. They know that if they win this fight, team fight, the run is over. They're committing everything to this fight, and they're reacting very, very quickly to losing Sinatra to try and turn this around. The problem is that they are still at a disadvantage. So at this point, if they're not getting picks, the reasonable approach is to just say, okay, the reason we're using ultimates is because if we use ultimates, we're going to force Titans to use ultimates. Because it's essentially a win-win for the Shock here. If Shock uses their ultimates and either Titans don't use their ultimates, which means they're going to get run over by the sound barrier, by the supercharged Shock, and they're going to lose someone, and the numbers go even, and then there's a high likelihood that Shock is actually going to win this team fight and the round. Or the Titans see that the Shock are committing ultimates, even though they're in a 5v6, and then they use their own ultimates in order to make sure that they actually get this flip. The reason why that is really good is because the more ultimates that Titans uses, the easier the retake for the Shock is going to be. So while this play in particular might look like wasted ultimates, it really is just a win-win. Either they're going to win the fight because they reacted quickly, or Titans is going to burn a bunch of ultimates, and the retake for the Shock is going to be that much easier. So they got the beat out, and they got Hexal's ultimate out. One ultimate they didn't get out, and Sumonsu's ultimate as well. Sumonsu's ultimate was the only one by the Titans that was genuinely wasted. Slime's beat was fine, because he wanted to play it safe. And Doomfist ultimate is one that charges fairly quickly. Hexal probably could have held onto it as well. But Sumonsu's ultimate was just very glaringly unnecessary. He did get 2 picks from it, but those were free kills anyways. So if Titans would have played this with a little bit more confidence, they might have been able to leave this fight with both of their DPS ultimates. In this case, it's not the end of the world, because they still have their Sigma ultimate, and they can just win off of that. But now they have less of a cushion to fall back on in case something goes wrong. But anyways, this is still going to be very difficult for the Shock, just because Titans has Sigma ultimate. Okay, at this point the Shock are just staggering to get extra percentage, but it doesn't really matter. Now, one of the very big problems for the Titans is actually that they lost Sumonsu. They lost the Reaper. Now, Titans has 2 decisions to make. Or rather, 1 decision, but they have 2 choices. Choice number 1 is they go for the exact same hold that the Shock did. They just copy it 1-on-1 because it's a very strong hold, which means that most of the team takes control of white, TZ plays on the point, and then they just engage around here, especially with the Sigma ultimate. Option number 2, choice number 2, is that they don't hold like that, and they start falling back in order to get the Reaper back. The main advantage of getting the Reaper back is that they're going to be in a 6v6. The main advantage of holding close is they're going to have a huge positional advantage. Now, unfortunately, Titans decides to go with the wrong approach. They sent their Lucio back to get the Reaper back from spawn, and the rest of the team, instead of taking control of white, they set up back on point. Now, this is terrible for multiple reasons. First of all, Reaper doesn't add that much to this fight anyways. Shock used their beat last fight, which is very, very important for the Titans to know. Because using Sigma ultimate into a team that doesn't have beat is very, very strong. You don't need a lot of follow-up damage. You should be able to win a fight off of that. Right? So, and on top of that, Seominsu doesn't even have his ultimate, which again just reduces the value. So they're bringing back, they're taxiing a Reaper without ultimate, instead of holding close and just playing around a Sigma ultimate, knowing that Shock doesn't have beat. And that is a huge mistake, because this allows Shock to do the following. They engage proactively. Again, Violet using his ultimate super fast is just because they want to play as quickly as possible. The faster they play, the more fights they're going to get in, the more retake attempts they're going to get. But Titans cannot contest white because they had to fall back for the pocket. But this, again, is super bad for the Titans now, because both Choi and Sinatra can take white control for free. So they have pressure coming in from the front, they have pressure coming in from the side, which means that the Titans are going to be forced into a corner, and they're just going to have to go back and back and back and back and give up more and more space, which just increases the pressure that they have.
Meteor strike.
So yeah, right here, I think this just summarizes it really well. Choi Hobin can do essentially whatever he wants. Sinatra can do whatever he wants because the ultimate is going off. And Janu isn't going to get any value out of his ultimate. Because if they are holding this far back, they're not holding the shock in this choke. Holding them in this choke is going to make it very, very easy for Janu to get value out of his ultimate. Instead, the shock are all spread out around the point. Sinatra's over here, Choi's over here, Smurf isn't even in the ultimate, Moth is somewhere over here, Violet is all the way in the back, which makes it very, very difficult to get a clean ultimate. Even if they go for an Orisa pull, which again, they don't really go for combos with the Orisa pull very often, again, most likely due to a lack of synergy and practice that, you know, Shock is just clearly better at. They're not going to get value out of their one fight-winning ultimate. And at this point, this is just pure cleanup from the side of the Shock. Now, at this point, this fight isn't super interesting, but I do quickly want to go into why the Shock are holding this far back. The reason why they're holding this far back is not, as some people might believe, because of the Lucio. This doesn't really matter. The Lucio is going to be back in like 5 seconds anyways. The reason they're holding this far back is because with a limited amount of time remaining, this forces the Titans to rush onto point. And if the enemy team is to rush, then they can't regroup properly. So while it would theoretically be an easier fight for them if they were holding closer, if they were holding right here, or if they were holding even closer over here, they know that that is just going to take way too much time. And it's much easier for them to just hold point and then shoot whoever touches the point first. Now, Titan's comp at this point makes 0 sense. They just chose Ryan to charge to spawn and Hammond to get back to point real quick. Choi has his ultimate as well. So in this case, the only way that Titans could realistically win this fight is if Shock messed up, if Sinatra would just miss a punch and get one shot, and then maybe they can win off of that. Although even then, Titans just don't have a front line that can last on point and push out Smurf. Shock is just cleaning it up. Not much to comment on. Okay, let's go over net market next. Still the same rollout with the Symmetra. However, Titans, they end up looking at Tizzy here. They mess up the rollout. Now this sucks for them because it means that Shock can go on point first. And in general, with any sort of non-mobile comp, so Bunker is a comp that just wants to set up somewhere. And this isn't traditional Bunker, but the front line in and of itself is still stationary. It's not really something that you want to rush in with like a Winston or a Reinhardt. They want to set up on point and then use these doors, which again are just phenomenal chokes to hold people in, to get an advantage. Ideally, both teams would get on the point at around the same time with equal rollouts, which means that the fight would just be a mirror on this point, where both teams could get through their doors, and then you have an Orisa shield here, Orisa shield here, and they just fight each other. In this case, Shock doesn't have to deal with that because Titans messes up the rollout, and this puts Titans at a very, very, very significant disadvantage. And they recognize the disadvantage, so you can see that Haxal actually thought about going towards that side. But then they realize, okay, the call came out, no, we're late, let's just go through green, let's just go through main. And Sinatra, he doesn't know that Titans is late for the rollout. So the strategy that Shock has here is that the entire team rolls out like this, and then they take the fight on the point, and then Sinatra ideally comes from the side, and he comes from behind. Now, the reason they're doing this is because they most likely, not because they expected Titans to be late, but again, it's just a sign of confidence, essentially, where instead of playing with his team, he is looking for that off angle to see if he can get an early pick on the Titans. However, he doesn't anticipate the Titans being this late, which means that when he walks around this corner, he actually gets spotted, and he immediately notices, okay, I can't go for this play, this is suicide. Had the Titans pushed up just a little bit more into this area, they would all be playing here, then Sinatra could go in for a punch, ideally get a pick, and then just use a slam to get back to his team. In this case, he can't do that because the entire enemy team is looking at him. Okay. Now, this is interesting because this is another very strong use of Doomfist Punch. Now, Sinatra's play kind of, it doesn't screw the Shock over, but it kind of kills the rhythm because of a lack of communication. So they end up holding fairly far forward, which in of itself isn't a problem, but holding this far forward only works if you can punish Titans immediately when they move through the choke, which in this case they just can't, because the rest of the team doesn't seem to be on the same page. They're playing much further back, and Sinatra just came from this side angle again. The reason this is bad is because it allows Titans to just rush in without getting punished, while Sinatra is still standing back there, not really doing anything. And what Haxal ends up doing is he lands the punch on Smurf, and this knocks Smurf all the way back. Now, the punch in of itself doesn't result in a kill. It does force out the Orisa Fortify, the golden, but that's not really the main value out of this punch. The main value of this is that this forces the Shock into a really, really bad position because they're all playing towards the back of the point. Which means that even though Shock had point control at the start, Titans just managed to get through this choke for essentially free, and now they have point control. And that is something that simply should not have happened, and that is something that Shock needs to communicate properly when Sinatra decides to go for that flank. They most likely didn't expect this play to go wrong. I'm assuming that in scrims, this play just worked over, fairly frequently, where Sinatra goes for the flank and then he comes in from the off angle. But in this case, that play had to get cancelled, which means that Sinatra just wasn't ready. Shock didn't know how to react. So my best guess is that they just didn't properly address how to react in case Sinatra's flank doesn't work out. Another thing that ends up happening is they get an opener on Janu. Let me slow this down a little. So Janu goes in, and Sinatra actually ends up landing a punch on Janu, which puts him into a really tough spot. And ideally, this needs to be communicated so that Striker can help Sinatra finish off this kill, which could give them an opener. And losing your Sigma this early into a fight is really bad. In this case, Janu has an ult advantage, albeit a very minor one. But if you lose your Sigma very early on into the fight, that means he's not going to get any ult charge for the rest of the fight, and that is going to make subsequent fights very, very difficult. So if they lose, if Shock manages to kill the Sigma, then it doesn't matter whether Titans wins the fight or they lose the fight. They're going to be at a disadvantage either way, because Shock is going to get their Sigma ultimate first. But yeah, unfortunately there just isn't enough follow-up, and it doesn't result in a kill. And at this point, the positioning for the Shock just isn't very great. This is just a case of Titan's DPS lineup getting significantly more value. Okay, so this is again another interesting play. Haxal is setting up on the high ground. The reason he's doing that is because that way he can scout this way, which again, with this comp, with double shield Doom Reaper, you just want to know where the enemy is coming from very quickly so you can set up. You need to play completely differently based on whether the enemy team comes through this choke, or whether they come from the high ground. So if Haksal is up there, then he can scout that fairly easily. Another reason why that's really good is because as long as Haksal is on the high ground, if the enemy team comes through this choke over here, he can punch over here and then play that high ground. If the enemy team comes through this choke, let me clear that real quick. If the enemy team comes through this choke, then he has a really good spot for him to land an uppercut when the enemy team goes in. So overall, this angle is just really, really good. He was looking towards this direction, and he got caught off guard by Choi actually coming from here, which is interesting by Choi, actually. Usually most people go through this side to get to the high ground, but Choi did it the other way around, which means that Haksal didn't expect it. So he gets caught out, and he's forced to go away. This gives Shock an opener, because they know that Haksal isn't going to be in this fight, and it sucks for Titans, because the ideal play that Titans wants to do here is very similar to what Shock did in their first team fight, where they want to use an auto coalescence just to ensure that they have sustain and to soften the enemy team up, and then they want to use a pull Doomfist combo. Because of this mess up, this gives Shock a small window of opportunity to actually do something, but the problem is that in this situation, Sinatra is also slightly late. Ideally, he would have been able to engage here a little bit earlier. And they don't manage to actually get any value out of their advantage. This fight is still way too early. So, in terms of ult economy, this fight is a fight that Titans should win, just because Sinatra doesn't have his ultimate, Haksal has his ultimate, right? Janu is close to getting his ultimate, Choi is at half. So Titans has the advantage, and this is not a fight that San Francisco Shock should focus on winning. They should, again, just focus on getting as many ultimates out as possible while farming up their own. But because Haksal was forced out, that could have given them an opener, they were unfortunately just not able to really capitalize on it. So that buys Titans the time to go for an Orisa pull and then eventually a Doomfist ultimate. And this is really just the same thing that Shock did on their own attack. So it's a fairly consistent play, especially if there are no support ultimates. So this fight being lost by the Shock, they lost an opportunity. They missed an opportunity. They could have maybe won it if Titans messed up even more. But winning that fight wasn't really a huge priority for them. So again, Haksal is setting up to scout on high ground. And Seominsu figures out that Shock is coming from the right side, which is completely fine. Each of these chokes has an advantage to it. I'm going to go a little bit into that later. Okay. So because Seominsu knows that the Shock are coming from this direction, he goes for the TP up high ground. Again, same reason as earlier, he just wants to get that angle on them. Haksal sees that Choi is coming from up here, so instead of contesting Choi, he just decides to regroup back with his team and help his team hold the enemy team at the choke. Okay. So, Sinatra, and again, he was deservedly probably the most impactful player for the Shock in this match. He's playing incredibly confident. He has his Doomfist ultimate, and Titans have their Sigma ultimate. So not only can he play super fast, because he has his ultimate, so there's no real way for the Titans to properly punish him or turn that into a kill. Worst case, he'll just use ult and he's going to be safe. And because Titans have their Sigma ultimate, that means that they need to play very proactively. Right? In this case, Moth has his ultimate already, and that is something that Titans most likely didn't expect. So just for reference, Titans is up 48% to 0. They won every single team fight so far, and as mentioned earlier, usually Lucios get their ult charge at around the same time. But for some reason, Titans Slime is at 92% ult charge, while Moth already has his ultimate. So they most likely, predicted that Moth wouldn't have his beat yet. And assuming that Moth wouldn't have had his beat faster than Slime despite just losing 2 team fights, then Janu could have gone in with his ultimate, and as I mentioned before, Sigma ultimate into Lucio ultimate is a very, very easy fight to win. In this case, that doesn't happen, because Sinatra goes in for the early, very, very confident engage that Titans most likely didn't expect. And that gives them an opener, which is incredibly strong for them. And again, Moth just goes in for the early beat as a reaction to Jano's ultimate, which means that Jano just doesn't get any value out of it. And again, just to point out, let me go back a little. Sinatra plays very, very aggressively, even after the teamfight is already won. At this point, 2 to 3 people are already dead, so Sinatra knows the teamfight is won. Instead of playing slow, he just keeps going in because he wants to clean up Titans as quickly as possible to, again, prevent them from getting any ult charge and to make sure that his team just kept spawn as quickly as possible. Him dying after the teamfight is already won really doesn't matter because he can get back incredibly quickly either way. And the benefits of clearing out Titans quickly outweigh the negatives of having to run back from spawn. Good, so Shock have point control now, and this fight is interesting because both teams have a bunch of ultimates, but Titans has a beat advantage, and beat advantage in this meta is very, very, very strong because you have Reaper and you have Doomfist, and both of those are just extremely aggressive characters that benefit a lot from having the beat. What Shock decide to do is they want to play proactively for some reason. Striker sets up in green, and they want to look for an early Sigma ultimate, which actually ends up being a mistake. Going for the Sigma ultimate here sucks, because it is very difficult to get proper follow-up on it. So, for one, as mentioned before, Sinatra just came back from spawn because he died while cleaning up the previous fight, which means that he can't properly follow up on this. He didn't have any time to really set up for this combo. And also, it is difficult for themselves to really follow up on it. I mean, just from Choi's perspective, he doesn't really have the line of sight. Smurf doesn't really have the line of sight. No one on Shock's side really has the line of sight to follow up on these targets, which isn't great. So the beat goes through. Striker can't actually confirm a kill. And this is a problem. So now Shock didn't get any value out of their ultimate. Titans would have used the beat anyways. I mean, they have beat advantage. And what Titans can do now is they can use the residual beat in order to play very, very aggressive. After this happens, both teams just use their ultimates essentially at the same time. So we can see right here, Titan still has the beat, Tizzy is using ulti, Simonsu is using ulti, and then Shock's side, again, they're using both DPS ultimates, and they're using the Orisa ultimate. The real difference here isn't which team is better at using ultimates. The real difference is just that Titans still has a lot of beat left, which means that just in terms of numbers, Shock really has no way of killing the Titans before the Titans kill them, which is exactly what happens. So Shock continue using ultimates, but it just isn't enough. The beat advantage is just way, way, way too much. And again, the advantage that the Shock had Sigma ultimate, so it was essentially a fight between Titans not messing up their Lucio ultimate and Shock not messing up the follow-up on the Sigma ultimate. Because if the follow-up on the Sigma ultimate is proper, even if it doesn't result in a kill, it's still enough to get Titans slow enough to where they have to play slow and where they have to play careful, at which point the beat essentially negates. So ideally, Shock uses their ultimate, and then Titans uses beat. But if you follow up on it properly, Titans isn't going to have any residual beat. But in that situation, Shock used Sigma ultimate. They didn't have any follow-up, which means that, for one, Titans probably didn't even need to use the beat, but they just wanted to play it safe, which is understandable. And they used beat, but because there was no follow-up damage, the beat didn't disappear, just stuck around. And then the fight afterwards, they had an advantage because they still had the beat. If Shock had the follow-up, then both teams would have used DPS ultimates afterwards, and at that point it just came down to which DPS got more value out of their ultimates. And again, the main thing is just that Shock didn't need to rush that play whatsoever. Sinatra was late, and Titans used their Sigma ultimate. So what they should have done is held Titans at these chokes instead of going for the early engage in green. It would have even been completely fine to let Titans get on point to actually walk through and then going for the Sigma ultimate, because again, it's just very, very free follow-up, so that they don't actually have any beat left over afterwards. But Shock is a very confident team, and you can tell that the pace at which they play is very quick, but it's also useful to know when it's fine to actually slow down the tempo by just a little bit in order to set your fights up properly. Okay, now this is the first real interesting fight, because neither team has any really good ultimates. So Shock has Coalescence, but the impact that Coalescence has compared to other ultimates like Beat or Sigma Ultimate is much, much smaller. So in this fight, it just comes down to which DPS player gets more value. Now, one interesting thing to note is that Choi makes the choice of rolling out on the high ground with Sinatra. The reason he's doing that is because he would expect Haksal to sit up here again to scout, and they're looking to see if they can force him out consistently. They don't just want to send out Sinatra up here alone. So he's just going up here with Sinatra to make sure that Sinatra gets that angle. Another advantage is if Choi is playing up here, he doesn't have to be worried about just getting picked early, because if he would roll out with his team and everyone just clumps up through there through this narrow choke, it is very easy for Haksal to get value, or for TC to get good pulls, or for them to get booped into something weird. Whereas the pressure is just a lot lower if they kind of split up like this, ensure that they get the high ground and get Sinatra into a good position. Now, this is where the mess up happens. So what Shock decides to do is they play very proactively. They see that Haksal isn't playing on the high ground, so Choi and Sinatra can just go in immediately. Shock also uses Koa, again, just using it as early as possible. The earlier you use it, the more value you're going to get out of it, because if you use it too late, then you're going to win or lose the team fight, and the rest of the Koa is just wasted afterwards. The problem is that, again, the tempo for the Shock is just faster than Striker can really accommodate. So the Shock go in, but Striker was still teleporting up here. So Striker right now isn't doing anything. There's this entire team fight going on down here, and nothing is really happening from Striker's side. So they're just lacking the damage, they're lacking the follow-up. The reason why that isn't being punished properly is because Xiaomitsu himself is also all the way in the back. If we go back here a little bit, actually. There we go. So Xiaomitsu was hiding down here, most likely because he expected Shock to maybe come from the right side, as they did last time, and then he could just come in from behind and apply pressure. That doesn't happen. So both Xiaomitsu and Striker are out of this fight. Haksal and Sinatra punch each other down, and this is where the advantage goes in for the Shock, because Haksal getting punched down here is much worse for him than Sinatra getting knocked down where he got knocked down, because he's, for one, he's behind the lion, which means that it's much more difficult for Titans to actually follow up on this. And also, Haksal in general just plays in front of everyone, he's not really behind the shield, which means that Haksal just gets punished extremely quickly. After that, eventually Striker ends up joining the fight. Haksal couldn't really do anything in that fight, he was forced to use his cooldowns to go out, which means that they get the pick on Tizzy, and once you lose your main tank in double shield, or your main tank in general, you have no real way of maintaining any of this space. So Titans is going to get continue just being pushed away. Neither team really has any ultimates, as mentioned before, so it just comes down to which team has the momentum, and in this case, Shock has the momentum. And again, just playing very aggressive, just making sure that they can close this out as quickly as possible. So that, in this case, Titans getting the percentage doesn't matter because it'll be only one fight being left anyways, but it's really just about the ultimates, because in the last fight, neither team had any ultimates, because they were used in the fight before, so you want to make sure that that fight ends as quickly as possible, so that they can't farm up any ultimates. Okay. So Shock decide to go for the same super strong setup that they do earlier. So Striker and Sinatra both set up on the high ground again. Striker can scout from here, and Sinatra is just ready to engage on people when they come down here. The setup is really just about the scouting. Now, if the Titans keep their confidence up, they're going to be able to engage before Moth gets his beat. So again, usually Lucio ultimates, assuming that they're being used around the same time, tend to be fairly in sync as they are right here. So they know that they just want to engage as quickly as possible with the ultimate so that they can use it before the beat comes out. And that would give them a huge advantage in this fight. But it really comes down to Shock using their positioning. Shock doesn't have great ultimates here. They're close to beat, but they don't have any Sigma ultimate. They're maybe close to going for a pull Doomfist combo, but that's really about it. It's not super good compared to Titans. But they have their DPS and angles, and they're holding a choke, which increases their potential of getting a pick and denying the Titans their engage. Now, this is where stuff gets interesting, because Titans actually goes for a very interesting play. So what the Titans does is they're rolling out main, they're all coming out of spawn, and they're going to go through this door. But what they end up doing is they send Twilight over to the right side. The reason why this is so good is because the following happens. Shock sees that Twilight is coming from that side, and all of them turn around towards Twilight because they believe that Titans is coming from that direction. The reason that is good for the Titans is because it draws all of the eyes towards this entrance, which means that they can come out of here for free. One of the main advantages that the Shock have on this defense is that they can hold the Titans at one of these chokes, and holding enemies at chokes just increases the pressure that they're under and makes it easier for them to get a pick. This way, the attention of the Shock is going to be directed towards Twilight, and Titans can just move through for free. You can actually see that when Sinatra drops down here, he even aims his punch towards here because that's where he expects the enemy team to be. But then the call comes out from the rest of the team as they turn around that, hey, they're not actually going there, they're coming from main. So the Titans manage to get through the choke for free, which is, again, just very strong play. Now, the attempt was really nice, but Sinatra caught onto it. He could quickly turn around his punch, but at this point, they just lost their choke advantage. However, what ends up happening is that Moth gets his beat, and he uses it straight away. And at this point, the Shock have a beat advantage, and as mentioned before, beat is extremely strong with this comp, because it allows especially Reaper and Doomfist to just do whatever they want, and that's exactly what Striker is doing. He knows that at this point, especially with his lifesteal against an Orisa, he is unkillable. He has the beat, so he can just rush onto TZ and pretty much one-shot him. And this sucks for the Titans, because if we look at how this point is structured, or how this defensive hold in general is structured, let me go back a little more actually. The way that this is structured is that Titans always has to come through chokes, whereas Shock has all of this area to themselves, which is bad for the same reason that holding the point on Control Center was bad. It is very difficult for Jano to get any value out of his ultimate, which is exactly what ends up happening here. So Shock are all spread all over the place, and eventually Janu ends up using his ultimate right here, and half of the Shock aren't even anywhere close to it, and Striker can just press shift, and they also still have the residual beat, which means it's very difficult for Titans to really apply any pressure during this ultimate. Yeah. So it was a risky play by the Titans. The fake out could give them the advantage, and they can get value out of the Sigma ultimate. And but the problem is that Titans can't play super slow here in order to farm up their beat, because then Shock would have just beat them at the choke. So Titans had two choices. Titans could either play slow, chill at the choke, and then just slowly farm up their beat, try and go even, or they can go for this bait play. But the problem with the bait play is that Shock is going to catch onto it fairly quickly, and as soon as Shock catches onto it, the Titans can just come in. The Titans are either they're out of the choke, or they're still in the choke. And if they're still in the choke, they're not going to get any advantage out of it, and then at that point, Twilight is just split. So Titans is slowly going to lose this team fight. The reason they're slowly going to lose this team fight is because Tizzy isn't alive, whereas Smurf is. So it's not like Titans is losing this team fight, it's just that they have no real way of winning this team fight. The only way that they can win this team fight is if they had a main tank and they could start pushing onto point, but there's no way that they can push out the Shock, even if they're getting picks left and right and they have a numbers advantage. As long as Shock has Smurf, they can just waste Titans' time, And while they're wasting Titans' time, Titans is just slowly going to bleed to death because they have no shields whatsoever to play around. So the question becomes, what should Titans have done? We know that they needed to play slow, so they could actually get beat before the fight and not worry too much about Moth getting his beat. And they know that if they're playing slow, they need to make sure that they aren't going to get punished. So the most consistent way for Titans to actually retake this is to walk up towards the high ground together and then just play the high ground. While they're on the high ground, there's no way for Shock to engage, which means that Slime can just farm his ultimate for free. And Titans also had the ult advantage, because Shock was overusing ultimates in the previous fight to actually take the point to begin with. Them going lower is an unnecessary risk. If they come from the top, there is no choke that they can really get held at. This would have also given them Doomfist ultimate on top of Sigma ultimate, so they could play on the high ground, they could have the beat for when Shock decides to do anything. They could use the Sigma ultimate to force out the beat, and then once the beat is out, they can try to use an Orisa pull and a Doomfist ultimate. Or the more consistent play, most likely, would be to try to use the Orisa pull, follow that up with the Sigma ultimate to get them all up in the air, and then after that they can follow up with the Doomfist ultimate on the people as they drop from the Sigma ultimate, because that's the best way for them to get value out of the Doomfist ultimate, because everyone is going to be stacked together because of the pull Sigma ultimate. It is a lot of ultimates, but in this case the Titans don't really care, because Shock doesn't have ultimates to counter, and because this would be the last fight anyways. So yeah, now Tizzy's back, but at this point, it's too late. Shock already have the point again. Okay. Now, what ends up happening here is that Xiaominsu uses his TP, and he actually messes it up. He wanted to use it, probably a little bit further back, around here, so that the rest of the Shock couldn't actually punish him, but that doesn't happen. He uses it too far forward, which means that Sinatra can just pre-charge his punch. If he could have reacted faster, maybe the punch would have dealt enough damage to actually kill Xiaominsu, or if he would have had proper follow-up, but Smurf wasn't following up on it, and Striker wasn't in position yet, which is really bad, because this mistake by Xiaominsu could have resulted in Xiaominsu dying, and the Shock getting an immediate numbers advantage, which essentially would have guaranteed them the map right there and then already. Now, it still sucks for the Titans, because as a reaction to this, Xiaominsu is forced to use his Wraith form to go out completely. Xiaominsu in this teamfight now is completely useless, and on top of having Janu on the Hammond, this isn't really looking super hot. Now, I don't approve of the Hammond swap, mainly because of how much time the Titans still had left. Winning this fight with a Hammond is incredibly difficult. Sigma just provides significantly more value. They did use the Sigma ultimate, so they wouldn't have gotten another one this round anyways, but just the value of his shift, of his shield, etc. is just way too good to pass up on. So swapping to Hammond here just wasn't the correct play. The main reason that Shock is playing this far back to begin with is because Choi Hyubin is still coming up from the spawn. If Choi Hyubin was with a Shock here, they would have done what they did previously, where they would try to get an engage on the Titans around green. Instead, they can't do that. They need to play back, and they need to play safe to wait for Choi to come back, which allows the Titans to get back on the point. So this is just a little bit unoptimal for both teams. Shock can't really hold properly because they're not a 6, and Titans can't really play the fight properly because they don't have their Sigma anymore. Now, Striker plays very, very proactively, and that's a mistake because, as mentioned before, Choi isn't with them, and having Choi here makes a very big difference because it allows the rest of the Shock to play more forward because they have more numbers, and the further forward the Shock play, the easier it is going to be for Striker to actually survive. But yeah, he goes for the TP behind, which in of itself, going for the TP behind is completely fine, but Titans see it, they just react to it as quickly as they possibly can, and you just can't get any consistent value out of it because there is no real follow-up. Now, this is another interesting play between Slime, Moth, and Xiaominsu. Both DPSs want to use their ultimates as quickly as possible, so Xiaominsu is going for his own ultimate, right here. The problem is, if Xiaominsu goes for his ultimate, Moth is going to be ready to just boop him away. That's a set play by Lucio players during this current meta, to look out for when the Reaper ults and then just boop them away. The way that you counter this play is by, for one, telling your team when you're about to use ultimate, usually at the start of the fight, and then making sure that your own Lucio, in this case Slime, is going to boop away the enemy Lucio, so that he can't boop you away. The problem here is that Slime wasn't in position to do that, which again is a lack of synergy. You can tell that Titans just isn't as comfortable on this comp, because if they were, then Slime wouldn't have been on the other end of the map. He would have been close to the rest of the team fight. Instead, Moth ends up getting the boop on Xiaominsu, which means that Xiaominsu misses out on the kill on Violet, and he misses out on the kill on Smurf. And you can see that Slime actually goes in, and he does end up going for the boop, but at this point, this is just way too late. So if Slime would have been closer to the team, if Xiaominsu would have communicated his play properly, this could have ended very, very differently. And with Smurf and Violet dead, this was almost guaranteed to be a win in Titan's favor despite the Hammond pick, just because they capitalized the fact that, again, Choi is just on the other end of the map, so it's a 6v5. And as a result of Xiaominsu not getting any value, at this point Choi comes back from the team fight, Titans was stuck with the Hammond, and at that point they just clean up the rest of the fight. Now, at this point, I'm just gonna let this run out, although it's over in 2 seconds anyways. This is just overtime kills and Tizzy on Reinhardt, and they're just cleaning up. There we go. So, what are the overall takeaways? Takeaway number 1 is that confidence is key. You could tell that Titans was not comfortable on the Brigitte comp. You could tell that they were overall just a lot more indecisive. They weren't set up for the fights properly. Whereas Shock, and especially Sinatra, was playing incredibly decisive. There was no real hesitance whatsoever. Second takeaway is to play around ultimates and to set up combos properly. Both teams did this decently. Shock just did it better. Shock overall got a more value out of their Sigma ultimates. Both got around the same value out of their pull Doomfist ultimates. Third, communicate where you are playing and where people are coming from. Communication on both sides could have been better. They weren't always on the same page. So Sinatra on the flank at the start here, Smurf sitting on the point instead of playing with his team when Titans decided to go stairs instead of main. Making sure that you hold in places where Doom can land punches. So Shock in general, their defensive setups just were a lot stronger in general. Either here when they were playing on the high grounds up here, or even on the control center when they were playing around the corner to get the punches. Titans did not get that setup because, remember, they went back for the Reaper. And lastly, beat is an incredibly important ultimate. Neither of these teams ever really wasted their beat, but any team that would waste their beat even once would stand no chance against either of these teams. The main piece of advice that I have for the Shock is to, for one, keep talking. Most of their lost team fights were caused by bad communication, not engaging in sync, not being on the same page as to where to hold. This match overall would have been a lot cleaner, and I'm imagining that comms were fairly erratic, so some info got lost. Now, full disclaimer, erratic comms in a grand finals match in front of 12,000 people is completely understandable, which is why comfort is so important. In a regular scrim, I would have imagined this round to be a little bit closer, because Titans wouldn't have been, as out of it. But you could tell that both of these teams were very nervous, and that sometimes very crucial information just got lost. For the Titans, the main piece of advice is that if you want to try out a comp to surprise the opponents, you need to make sure that you're 100% on the same page as to how you can actually capitalize on that surprise element. In most cases, relying on a set play is way too cheesy, and it's just better to go with Moira. Really, the only reason you would pick Brigitte there is to punish the Reaper and the Doom. In all other categories, Moira is just objectively superior. If your composition relies on an enemy screwing up, like the Doom or Reaper getting brick bashed and dying, then it's not a great comp to begin with. It can go very right if you win and you snowball and you get rallies. But even if they would have won the first fight, they would have had a very difficult time holding after that, because that trick would get old, Shock would just play around it, and the lack of sustain with the Brigitte is just terrible compared to a Moira. Titans also wasn't very comfortable with their set plays. Shock's combos and their engages were more natural, Sinatra was decisive and confident, and the Titans didn't show that. It wasn't a lack of communication on the Titans. I have the feeling that Titans' communication in this match was significantly better than Shock's communication. It's natural synergy, it's trust, it's confidence, it's decisiveness, and it's second-naturedness of these set plays that Titans needed, and they simply didn't have that. And either their practice wasn't effective enough, or it wasn't targeted enough, they didn't focus on it. Maybe their competition just wasn't good enough. That could be it as well. Maybe the teams that they were scrimming leading up to this tournament just weren't super great. Or potentially they just didn't have enough time together, which is, fairly reasonable. I mean, TZ, for example, is a fairly recent addition. Shock's roster is a little bit more, they've been together for a little bit more, especially their core. So that's really what this match overall came down to. That's it for my analysis of the first map of the Grand Finals. I'm going to go over the remaining maps as well. If you are interested in contacting me, all of my contact information, my email, my Discord tag, my Twitter, everything is going to be down in the description. And I'll try to get these other analysis pieces uploaded as soon as I can get to them.